In the last session, we talked about Jesus provoking the Pharisees, and he picks up where he left off in what we'll talk about today. Picking up in Luke chapter 6. Jesus was passing through some grain fields on a Sabbath day, and his disciples were picking the heads of grain, rubbing them in their hands and eating the grain. Now, in general, there's nothing wrong with that. It's not like trespassing, or it's not theft or anything. In the Torah, which is the covenant God made with his people, the first 5 books of the Bible, then God said that if you're hungry and you're near somebody's field, you can just go up to the outskirts of the field, grab a little grain, and eat it. No big deal. Landowners were required to let people do that. So there's nothing wrong with doing that. The Pharisees had trouble with this because it happened on a Sabbath day. So the Sabbath day is a day of rest. The Torah says you do no work at all on the Sabbath day. So what happened throughout history was that the people were disobeying God all over the place. The things that the prophets talk about over and over again are you're serving other gods and you're oppressing the poor and the needy when you should be helping them. You're practicing injustice instead of justice. Those are the 2 main themes. But another theme that came up, especially in the book of Jeremiah, was about the Sabbath day. The people were neglecting the Sabbath day. They discovered, hey, if I work that 1 extra day every week, I make more money, 1/7 more. And that, sounded good to people. And, one family did it and fire didn't come from heaven and destroy them. And so another family did it. And pretty soon everybody's disobeying the Sabbath for many, many years. And one of the things Jeremiah the prophet said was, you're going to be taken out of your land, brought to Babylon, and you're going to stay there in Babylon for 70 years so that the Sabbaths that you've neglected, the land gets their Sabbaths, right? It's like the accumulation of them. Well, one of the things in Babylon that the religious leaders tried to do was to protect themselves, protect Israel from breaking those Sabbath laws again. And this is true of all the commandments, really. They came up with what they call the oral law. Now, the Jews will say that the oral law goes directly back to Moses. God told Moses, write down certain laws, and that's the written Torah, and then maintain the other Torah orally, the oral Torah. I personally don't think that's true, and a lot of scholars will say what I'm going to say. I recognize how arrogant that is of me to say that I question and I don't believe thousands of years of Jewish history and teaching. But here's my reasoning. Among other things, King Josiah was one of the good kings of Judah, and he was trying to reform Judah. This was after the Civil War. Israel had been destroyed already by Assyria, and Josiah, he knew that the king before him was a horrible, evil king who really led the people away from the Lord very steeply. Kings before him had sacrificed to other gods in God's temple, the Lord's temple, and other kings had just let the Lord's temple just fall to pieces. They didn't take care of it. There was no maintenance on it. It was neglected, and it was falling apart. So Josiah was having the temple cleaned out, and he was starting to restore parts of the temple. And when he was doing this, he had his, the servants out doing the work, and the servants found a book that they started reading and said, wow, we better show this to the king. They brought it back to King Josiah, who started reading it and said, well, this is directly from God. This is what God says, the way God says we're supposed to live. We've broken every one of these laws. The scroll that they brought him ended up being a scroll of the Torah. And it might have been Deuteronomy. I think personally that it was probably the entire Torah. A lot of people disagree with me there, but either way, Josiah read this and he tore his robes, saying, "We didn't know. Like we're supposed to live, this way. This Torah scroll tells us exactly how to live and how not to live, and we've broken every one of these things. No wonder things are falling apart around us." And that led to some major reforms. Well, my thinking is the oral Torah is really helping the people live out the written Torah. If they didn't know that they were even breaking the written Torah, how could they know about the oral Torah? If they had the oral Torah, they would know what they're supposed to do and not do. They wouldn't be surprised to find the rules in the written Torah. So I don't think that the oral Torah was really at least much of a thing if a thing at all, until the Babylonian captivity, and they developed the synagogue model. All right, so that's just some trivia for those of you who have a little more foundation in Scripture. So for those of you who don't know a lot of these things, who are newer to this, what's going on here is that during the time where the oral tradition was being created, the people knew that they part of the reason they were in exile and being punished by God was for breaking the Sabbath. That was one of many things, but it was one of the big ones. And so they wanted to make sure that they never would break the Torah as a nation like this again. And we'll start with the Sabbath laws. All right, what does it mean to do work on the Sabbath? Obviously, going out and harvesting my fields is going to be work. I can't do that on the Sabbath. How does God see work? Right? If I get hungry and I'm out near my fields and I grab a little grain and rub my hands together and the chaff flies and I have nothing left but the grain and I eat it, right? It's good. I've had a little snack, right? No big deal. But what if God sees that as harvesting? Because technically speaking, by definition, I'm harvesting some grain. And have I just done work on the Sabbath? Are we going to be punished for working on the Sabbath if we're all doing this kind of thing? You know what? Let's just say that nobody is allowed to even grab a little bit of grain on the Sabbath because we don't want to break the Sabbath laws. We don't want to end up harvesting on the Sabbath. Well, if I go out and water my crops, I'm obviously working on the Sabbath. What if I spill a little water? Or what if I spit and my saliva rolls onto the dirt and forms mud? I mean, technically, I'm watering part of my crops. Really small part, but still, I'm watering my crops. Will God see that as work? Right? I don't necessarily think it's work, but will God see that as work? We don't want to take any chances, so nobody's allowed to spit in their fields on the Sabbath day. And so these are the things that are in the oral law. It's a lot of things. Some people call it the oral traditions. Some people call it the oral law. But they're things that are meant to protect the Jewish people from violating their covenant with the Lord. And the motivation is good, but Adam and Eve tried that. Didn't work so well for them either, right? So basically the disciples are breaking this oral tradition, this oral law, that they're working supposedly on the Sabbath because they took a little grain and harvested that little bit of grain for a snack. And the way it's written here, it looks like Jesus may have done the same thing. So the Pharisees are saying, why are you doing what is not lawful on the Sabbath? And they might be speaking only of the apostles or the disciples, but they might be speaking about Jesus himself as well. Jesus answered them. Now, the Pharisees knew Scripture. They knew the Hebrew Bible better than any of us even aspire to. Like, it's memorized. They know they know it forwards and backwards. Jesus said, haven't you even read about David? Right? The king of Israel, like the best king Israel has ever had. The Pharisees had this all memorized. Jesus says, haven't you even read about David? What David did when he was hungry, and he entered the house of God and took the consecrated bread, which is not lawful for any man to eat except the priests alone. And David also gave it to his companions. And then he said, the Son of Man, speaking of himself, the Son of Man is Lord of the Sabbath. Well, that would be like me in my Bible teaching saying, Sunday now is the Sabbath day, and I am the Lord of this. I have all the authority over your Sundays. Right? You'd be like, who do you think you are? Right? Well, Jesus is here saying, I am Lord of the Sabbath. I have the authority to tell you, Pharisees, what's okay and what's not on the Sabbath day. And you just kind of don't say that to the Pharisees, unless you're Jesus. Well, on another Sabbath, he was in the synagogue teaching, and there was a man whose right hand was withered, right? So he's got this hand all curled up, and he has no control over it. Can't use it. The scribes and Pharisees were watching him closely to see if he healed on the Sabbath, so they might find a reason to accuse him. Right? The Pharisees are starting to realize how much danger Jesus is going to get them into, and they want him stopped, trying to find a way to stop him. So they follow this guy with the crippled hand to the synagogue, and they say, you know what? If he's in the synagogue, I bet that either right before or right after the synagogue service, Jesus is going to heal the guy. And we'll be there as witnesses. We'll be able to accuse him to, the powers that be, and we can take care of this problem. So Jesus is in the synagogue teaching, like he did very often, and he saw the guy, and instead of waiting till after the synagogue service, Jesus just looked right at the guy and said, "Excuse me, you. Yeah, yes, you. Come forward, please. Come up front." And the man with that withered hand, right, he walks up there and doesn't really quite know what's going on. Probably heard that Jesus heals people, and he's like, "What's he doing? Is he going to heal me?" And the Pharisees and the religious leaders, they're watching this, saying, "He's not really going to do this right in the middle of the synagogue service, right? It's bad enough he does it on the Sabbath. Is he going to do this right in front of everybody during the service?" And sure enough, Jesus looks at everybody and he says to them, "I ask you, is it lawful to do what is good or to do harm on the Sabbath? Should we save life or destroy life on the Sabbath?" And nobody answered. He looked around at all of them, almost daring them to say something, and then told the guy, "Stretch out your hand." And this guy just kind of went, huge smile, eyes real big. He starts rejoicing, praising God. Everybody there is amazed, right? Who is this guy who heals like this? Except the Pharisees and the religious leaders were furious. Luke says they were filled with rage, and they discussed together what they might do to Jesus. This man needs to be stopped. And again, like we mentioned in the last session, if this man is not Messiah, and look what he just did, he's obviously not Messiah. He's breaking all these laws, the oral law, and Messiah would never do that. He's going to get us killed. We need to find a way to stop him. Well, after this, Luke has a little side note where Jesus chooses the 12 apostles, and they're named here. So Simon, who's called Peter, when you refer to Peter, his real name is Simon. Jesus named him Peter, which means rock. I always picture it like Jesus is, I don't know, think of Peter's personality, and I think Jesus might have been calling him Rocky or something like that, a fun name. Andrew, his brother. So there's Peter and Andrew. James and John, they're brothers. Philip and Bartholomew. Matthew and Thomas. James, the son of Alphaeus. And another Simon called the Zealot, just enough Simons to confuse us. Judas, the son of James. And Judas Iscariot. So 2 Simons and 2 Judases. Simon, the son of Judas, and Judas Iscariot, who Luke mentions here, became a traitor. Right? So think about the people that Jesus is calling. He has a bunch of fishermen fishermen were seen as very holy, godly people, because in general, people were afraid to be out on the sea. Not many people really swam. People didn't like being out in the sea. And if you've ever been, like, I grew up spending a lot of time at the ocean, and I would sit out there on a jetty at night, and I was used to it. Like, I knew it really well. I could walk through in the dark with, just climbing on all the rocks and everything with no problem. And just a tiny bit of light, that's all I needed. I kind of knew my way around really well. And still, even though I was so familiar with it for such a long part of my life, at times I would sit out there at the end of a jetty at night, and it would get really dark, and it would be creepy. And that's just at the end of a jetty. That's not even like out in the ocean or anything. So it can just get really creepy there. And that's the way people felt about the sea. So fishermen were seen as really holy people, but they were also really gruff people. If I'm correct about this, I'm pretty sure they were just known for, temper. You think like the typical Irishman, right? If you look at the stereotype of an Irishman in movies, got a temper, you're ready to drop the gloves and fight for anything, bit of language here and there, not the, you're not like PhD, right? You don't have that much education. You don't have the intellect that some others have. All right, that's kind of the way I picture, especially Peter, but all these fishermen would be kind of like that, well respected, seen as godly men, and yet, uh, the tempers, they did have some language here and there, right? So that's part of the group. Then there's Matthew, the tax collector, who's extremely smart, very good at math, and known for ripping off his own people and hated by most Jews. And almost all Jews would have hated him. Uh, then you have this guy, Simon, who's a zealot. Zealot is one who's ready to stand up and fight against Rome. You won't pay taxes to Rome. You won't support Rome in any way, and you'd rather die than do anything to support Rome. You have this zealot sitting at the same table sharing food with the tax collector and a bunch of fishermen and some other people, right? This group that Jesus picks has got to raise some eyebrows. Well, Luke mentions the Beatitudes next, and I'm going to switch back to Matthew. Matthew chapter 5 gives us a really full version of what's called the Sermon on the Mount. It's the fancy name for it is the Beatitudes. Basically, Jesus went up on a mountain, started teaching, but he's kind of retelling the law. It starts out, blessed are the poor in spirit, theirs is the kingdom of heaven, blessed are those who mourn, they shall be comforted, etc. You have heard it said, and he quotes something from the Torah, but I say to you this, and he's taking the law of Moses, the Torah, this is the covenant God made with Israel, and he's almost making it harder to live by, right? You've heard it said, you shall not commit murder. Whoever commits murder shall be liable to the court. But I say to you that everyone who is angry with his brother shall be guilty before the court. Right? He's raising the stakes here, he's making it that much harder, and he's saying, here's what the Torah says, but I say this. I'll raise it another level. Well, one of the things Matthew is doing, Matthew's presenting Jesus as the king who's come in the line of David. And that king, Matthew as a Jew, knows that that king is also considered the next Moses. So Moses was the one who received the law from God, the Torah, and wrote it all down. He led the people, and the people wanted, they said, Moses, you talk to God, and then you tell us what God said. If we hear God's voice again, we'll die. And God respected that and promised them there will always be a prophet among you like Moses. And the people were waiting for this sort of next Moses, right? Moses died and Joshua took over, and there were prophets all along, but they're waiting for the prophet or the next Moses to come. And Matthew says that Jesus went up on a mountain and started teaching them, and he sort of gives them his own law, right? Jesus is that Moses who's going up on the mountain and giving the law. So I'm flipping back to Luke chapter 7. And for those of you trying to follow along in your Bibles, like always, I say good luck to you. Just all over the place. Well, in Luke 7, Jesus, remember his cousin John, right? John the Baptist. Well, he was thrown in prison. And if you're Jesus' cousin, you probably know a lot about Jesus. And John, right, remember John is a prophet. He was the one baptizing people in the Jordan, and he recognized Jesus as the Lamb of God. He pointed at Jesus and said, the Lamb of God, it takes away the sins of the world. And right, he knows Jesus is Messiah. He has these insights into what Jesus would do. Now, John's thrown in prison. So if you're John and your cousin is the king, Messiah, who's come to make all things right, if it were me, I would expect my cousin, this Messiah, to kind of, do his thing and take the throne and go against Rome already so I can get out of prison, right? Not just so I can get out of prison, but I would certainly expect that to happen. Well, a lot of time goes by. Jesus is going around teaching and healing and doing miracles and teaching some more. And John finally sends messengers to Jesus. And he said, are you the expected one, or do we look for someone else? When the men came to Jesus, they said, John the Baptist has sent us to you to ask, are you the expected one, or do we look for someone else? And at that very time, Jesus cured many of the disciples of afflictions, or many people, rather, of diseases and afflictions and evil spirits. And he gave sight to many who were blind. So Jesus said, "Go and report to John. Tell them what you have seen and heard. The blind receive sight, the lame walk, the lepers are cleansed, and the deaf hear, the dead are raised, and the poor have the gospel preached to them." So Jesus, he doesn't come right out and say, "Yes, I'm the one," but he says, "Tell them what you see." And they've seen all these things. Jesus tells them specifically, "You've seen all these things. Tell John what you've seen." And that's John's answer. "Yes, you know I am, because you know what I'm doing." I suspect that John, when he gets this report, would be really excited and a little disappointed at the same time. Like, you are the one we're expecting. You are this anointed one, this Messiah, the king. Can't you, pull a couple strings and get me out of prison? I kind of suspect that's a little bit of what's going on. And the messengers left to go give John this message. Jesus added, by the way, "Blessed is he who does not take offense at me." In other words, John, I know you don't get it, but hang in there. You won't understand, but yes, I'm the one. So the messengers left. After they left, Jesus starts praising his cousin John to everybody. All right, so I'm going to flip back now to Mark chapter 4. And the people, so Jesus had done some miracles. He's been teaching. And at some point, evening came, and Jesus said to the guys, "Hey, let's go to the other side of the lake." So the Sea of Galilee. All right, now the Sea of Galilee, it's not huge. From east to west, it's probably about 2 miles wide. North to south, it's probably, I think, 10 or 12 miles long. And you have the Mediterranean Sea not too far away, and a lot of cool air coming off the sea. Then you hit a mountain range. It's a pretty small mountain range, but it's a mountain range. Then you have the Sea of Galilee, then another small mountain range, and then there's desert. So in the right conditions, you have the hot air from the desert, the cool air from the Mediterranean mixing, and it can create these storms that come up pretty quickly with massive waves. And the boat that they were in, probably, there's a museum in Galilee that has a boat that they call the Jesus boat. And the boat dates back to roughly the time of Jesus. Unlikely, I think, that Jesus would have been in the boat, but it is possible, because the population wasn't all that high. And if it was really from the time of Jesus, there were some fishing communities. There were a bunch of fishermen there. It's possible Jesus got to know them, some of these fishermen, and actually was in that boat. So wouldn't rule it out, but it's unlikely that it actually is that. But anyway, it gives you a glimpse of what these boats would look like. They're made of wood. They're not, they didn't have like fancy motors and fiberglass and lights and all that stuff. It was a wood boat, and very sturdy. The boat in the museum, it's in bad shape, obviously, but it's 2,000 years old. So, it's done pretty well. But in a huge, massive storm, they can kind of come to pieces. So Jesus gets into the boat. He says, "Let's go to the other side of the sea." And he's in the boat with a whole bunch of fishermen, right? They know the water. They know the sea. And this storm came up. Mark, in his gospel, he describes it as a fierce gale of wind. And the waves were breaking over the boat so much that the boat was filling up with water. So the storm just came up very quickly. Massive waves that were breaking over the side of the boat. The boat's filling up with water. Jesus, of course, was sound asleep, just sitting there on the cushion. And they woke him up and said, "Teacher, do you not care that we are dying?" Right? Now, I had a friend take me up flying a bunch of times. The first time he took me flying, I'd been flying in a small plane before, but he didn't really know much about my background or anything. And he kept saying, he's got the controls, and he's saying, "Okay, I'm going to make a right turn. It's going to feel pretty steep, but it's okay. Okay, now I'm going to go a little bit to the left and drop a little bit." And he's kind of bracing me for everything. And eventually I looked at him and I said, "Listen, if you look scared, I'll get scared. Otherwise, do whatever you want. I'll have fun." Right? And so, once he knew I was really okay with it, we had a great old time. Um, but I meant it. Like, I won't get scared if he's flying the plane. He's experienced. If he looks scared, yeah, then I'll get nervous. But until then, he's in control. He's got the plane. And here, Jesus is sound asleep. A bunch of fishermen who spend their careers on the water and have experienced many storms, when they wake a teacher up to say, "Don't you care that we're about to die?" You're about to die. Right? This is a bad storm, and this is when the sailors, when the fishermen are panicking, it's time to panic. So they wake Jesus up. "Do you not care that we are dying?" And I pictured Jesus, right, probably exhausted. He was sound asleep. The disciples woke him up to tell him that they're about to die because the boat's going to sink. He hasn't had coffee, right? He sits up, stands. The text says he got up, and he looks out over the boat and rebuked the wind and the sea, saying, my translation here says, "Hush, be still." Right? That sounds so gentle. I've read, though, that the actual Greek words that he used were very, very forceful, strong words. More likely, it would be translated accurately. Jesus looked out at the storm and just shouted, "Shut up!" And everything just stopped. Mark says, the wind died down, the sea became perfectly calm. And Jesus turned around to them and said, "Why are you afraid? Do you have so little faith?" And then they became very afraid and said to one another, "Who is this? Even the wind and the sea obey him." So, you're in that boat with Jesus. You think you're going to die. Jesus stands up and tells the wind, the storm, to shut up. Everything just stops and is dead silent. And you're there looking at Jesus, who just turns around and says, "Have some faith, people." Lies back down, goes back to sleep. Right? Like, it's like, who is this guy? And they don't know, right? They hadn't read the Gospels yet. So they don't know who this is. They're trying to figure all this stuff out. And they're just more and more amazed with this guy, Jesus. So as the disciples are figuring out who he is, the religious leaders are still trying to figure out who he is and how they can stop him, because obviously he's not Messiah as far as they're concerned. And all these things kind of come together as the Gospels go on. So we'll pick up there in the next session.